You're listening to the Vint podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint podcast, a production of the Vint Marketplace, your source for premium wine and spirits at vintmarketplace.com. This episode is presented by Coravin. Coravin is the world leader in at-home wine preservation, allowing you to pour a glass of your favorite wine and enjoy more bottles from your cellar without ever having to pop the cork. Today I'm joined back in studio by Billy Galanko. How you doing, Billy?
I'm doing very well. Your Coravin ad read reminds me that we need to remind our listeners that we're going to be giving away 2 Coravin sparkling units through the rest of the year. We're still working out how to enter to win those, but everybody should get excited because the Coravin sparkling, they're absolutely fantastic. We both have one, and yeah, it'll be an exciting giveaway coming up.
Yeah, and I had a funny sort of Coravin story, but I want to pause on the Coravin sparkling. That's one of the most amazing devices that I've used across like any food and beverage. Maybe my Ninja blender is pretty cool, but the Coravin sparkling is amazing. It preserves those wines perfectly even after opening, which almost feels like an inconceivable idea that you could open a vintage champagne, pour it over the course of 2 hours, and then preserve it for another 3 weeks. Just crazy. It's an awesome device and looking forward to giving that away to folks. But my sort of funny Coravin story from this past weekend, I was at a dinner party and I got a call from my dad. So I'm like, okay, see, because they knew we were out. I was like, all right, I better answer this. So I answer it and they have friends over and they're trying to figure out how to use their Coravin because they're messing with it. It won't pour any wine. And so I was walking them through all the steps, like everything, and they still couldn't do it. I said, okay, just open the bottle. You're not going to be able to use your Coravin. And 2 days later, I get over there and I take a look at it, and their capsule was empty, like their argon capsule, which I don't think they even knew that there were argon capsules that you had to replace, like to give it more gas. And so I showed them that, and I just thought it was funny because we took the needle out. I had them like blowing in the front of it, like everything. But it was the capsules. That's a good reminder to use your discount to go to Coravin and purchase more capsules so you don't find yourself in a situation where you need gas and you don't have any replacement capsules for your Coravin. And they're super affordable with the discount code. So
that's true. I need to stock up on more of those. Let's get to the news for today before our guests. Actually, we'll slightly tease our guest here. It's somebody I've been trying to have on the podcast almost from the get-go. It's McNeil, the author of the Wine Bible. So we will get to her shortly. Really excited for that interview. But first, we will get to the news. And the article I have chosen from last week's Vint Marketplace news is about Oregon Chardonnay. Now, the title I picked in our newsletter is a little less clicky, but I want to read the one from the New Wine Reviews. It says, "Are these the best white wines in America?" And it's referring to Walter Scott's Chardonnays.
Yeah, it's a bold claim, but it's hard to name a more promising or even just better today white wine region than Oregon. Or when I say region, Eola Amity. Yeah, I think it's probably not that clickbaity to say that. And Walter Scott's, I actually don't know have you had a Walter Scott Chardonnay? Or
no, I just had their Pinot Noir
knowledge.
Yeah. But I can only imagine because the quality of Walter Scott's wines in general are amazing. Mm-hmm. And I have yet to come across an Oregon Willamette Valley Chardonnay that is underwhelmed me. If anything, we have really high expectations for these, even after, as a company, we spent like a week up there last year and they continue to exceed expectations. So when I read this, at first I was like, this is a little, you're trying to get me to click. But then I was like, one of the top producers in all of Oregon, putting a lot of time and care into it. I bet these are amazing wines.
I agree. That's a great way to characterize it. Is those wines have always, almost from across the board, from every producer and at every sort of designation, whether it's differences in elevation or Willamette Valley designated wines or single vineyard wines, they've all exceeded expectation. But one thing that I think is, for me, jury's still out on just because I haven't had a ton of these is those wines with a little bit of age on them. So I'm just curious. I do have some in my cellar right now and super happy to put a few away for the longer term because relative to the value that I think you're getting right away. The price is amazing in Oregon. So yeah, I think they're great wines to drink right now. Great wines to, take a flyer on to age. Of the producers that we've talked to, they all, stand behind the fact that their wines will mature really well. But I'm looking forward to having one with 10 or 15 years on it and see what comes of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we've gotten a few that had above 5, but not quite 10.
5, 7. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm excited, but they're all evolving perfectly. Yeah. Keep your eye on that space. Start stocking up now, because once people continue to taste them old, they're going to go back and try to buy more. So
Sure.
they're only getting more expensive. I think this article is noting how some of their general ones are still like $50, single vineyards, $80+. So it's still, compared to Burgundy, quite the steal, which is the best lateral. Speaking of oxidized aged wines too, and our favorite wine joke, I randomly came across 2 Jurançon wines this weekend. On Friday, we went to a place for dinner, and they had a Botrytized like sweet wine for dessert from Jurançon. And then on Sunday, we were at a wine bar up in this place called Idlewild, a small mountain town, but they had a natural wine bar. And it was a still dry version from the same place, which is rare that I come across wines from Jurançon. It's spelled Jurancon with a little thing on the C. I rarely come across these wines. Came across 2, and the main grapes are Gros Manseng and Petit Manseng.
Nice.
So
what, Gros Manseng?
Gros Manseng. So it's like basically whenever you see Gros and Petit in a French
GROS, right?
Yeah. If you see that next to a French grape name, typically they're talking about a grapes that are very similar, but one tends to have larger berries, which is the Gros Manseng, and then Petit Manseng is smaller berries.
So interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So you'll see that in a few other varieties as well.
Can you have a botrytized wine that's made in a sparkling method? Is that technically possible, or is there something with?
I think from what I've read, that whatever the amethyst or whatever it's called that the botrytis fungus or mold actually puts into the grapes does not work well for a sparkling point of view. But I would love to look more into that. But I think there's a distinct reason that's never been common. I don't think it works well. There's something either in the secondary fermentation, or I think the closest you could get would be making a base wine dry and then
adding a sparkling wine and
putting in the tirage as like to make the bubbles, and then on your dosage on the way out, just pouring botrytis wine in there, like a heavy dosage, like how you make like a sweeter champagne.
You mean the botrytis wine would be the dosage, basically?
Yeah, at the end, and that would dictate the sweetness of the final wine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't think if you put it in the beginning and tried to make like a pet nat, I just don't think that would go well.
That's something to look into. I'm sure people have done it, bottled it, and sold it.
I'm gonna look for it. If you can
think of it, people have tried to produce it and sell it. So maybe there's something out there we can get our hands on.
I think a lot of people may enjoy late harvest wines for their sweetness. I just have a soft spot for like the ginger, saffron. There's like the depth that you get from botrytis wines. I absolutely adore it. So if I could find a sparkling one with that, I would do it. But I'm pretty positive I read that it's not normal, not possible.
Maybe there's I actually don't know if there's probably not a section on sparkling botrytized wines in the Wine Bible, but I'm sure there's some clues that we could take from the Wine Bible and Karen McNeil on that. That was a really great conversation. It was worth the 3-year wait to have Karen on, don't you think?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And then I think we've mentioned many times how we've tried to have certain guests on for a long extended period of time. And Karen is great. She actually replied right away when I reached out years ago, but then due to life events and things happening on both sides, we weren't able to actually have her in the studio. So we've been literally just emailing back and forth with her and her team.
Yep.
So she was great. And I think so, just to take one little step back, for people, the Wine Bible is probably the most ubiquitous wine resource. And it's one of the few that I've recommend to people just getting into wine, but also my friends who are already into wine. It's one of the most thorough and approachable ways of getting such deep knowledge about wine that I could possibly recommend. If you go to any quality wine bar, I've actually seen this book no matter where I've been. I could be in like the middle of the country, I can be in New York City, I can be in LA, and I see the Wine Bible in most wine forward restaurants and bars just sitting somewhere. So it was really cool to be able to talk to her and to find out that she says she writes every word. Like she has people help her do the research, but I had no idea she was literally the person behind the voice.
Yeah, it's the thickest, most substantial book that you'll find in any Barnes & Noble on wine.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, it definitely is. I was in one the other day, and the wine section was scarce. In the one that I was at near me, it was scarce, and the wine Bible was definitely the most extensive. But I've also seen it at Men's Warehouse. They had a copy.
That goes to tell you.
This is not a Men's Warehouse plug. I am not. We can riff on that in another intro. Men's Warehouse, stay away. But the one that I was at recently had a wine Bible on the shelf, like as a decoration, which I thought was interesting.
Classy. I guess you're probably right at Barnes and Noble. I'm thinking of my personal wine book collection, and it's definitely not the fattest.
Oh, no. Yeah, here. I'm thinking of, you said ubiquitous, right? I'm thinking about what's like the sort of brick and mortar bookstore that everyone has in their city somewhere. And yeah, that it stands out.
Yeah. So without getting too much into what we're going to talk about, she basically tells us things that she's looking forward to in terms of trends, regions to look out for. She goes through the process a little bit about making the book, just gives you a lot of behind the scenes, and then also a lot of insight into her new website, Wine Speed, as well. It's not that new. It was new when we were trying to have her on initially, but it's a really cool website. She shares a lot of fun facts, figures, just her own wine musings. Each week she sends out a newsletter. So it's a really cool way to get a direct access to Karen without having to wait every 5 years for the new wine Bible to come out, because she says that's how long it takes. So it's really cool. I recommend subscribing there, getting the wine Bible, then you'll be set to learn. That's how I became at least passed my intro and certified sommelier exams. I just read the wine Bible. So
yeah, as far as writers, critics, researchers, Karen stands alone in that space. So yeah, it was a delight to have her. Hopefully we'll have her on in less than another 3 years, but
Quick plug for our YouTube too. If you want to hear more about my journey becoming a certified sommelier in 5 months, we just released a video about that as well. Some of you might have heard that before, but just plug in the YouTube.
Sounds good. Before we get into our interview, word from Coravin. Remember, if you're looking to drink more wine from your cellar, maybe some of those Oregon wines that you're letting age, but you want to try them now, but you're worried that you're going to waste it, you should grab a Coravin system. You can visit coravin.com and use Vint15 for 15% off your purchase of any of their devices. If you're a member of the trade, visit trade.coravin.com for exclusive discounts on their full range of products and accessories for home and work. Yeah, pick up a Coravin, especially before the holidays, or tune into our upcoming episodes because Billy said we'll be giving away one of those awesome Coravin sparklings, which I believe are valued at over $500. Yeah, they're an awesome thing to have at the table to share more sparkling wine this Thanksgiving and Christmas or around the holiday season. So without further ado, here's our interview with Karen MacNeil.
Hi, Karen. Thanks so much for joining today.
Hey, Billy. Hi, Brady. Great to be with you.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be chatting with you. It's been years since I first read your book as part of my studying for my intro sommelier exam, and that really kicked off my wine journey. So I'm so excited to have you and to share more about what you're currently working on, as well as your wine Bible.
Thank you. Yeah, the wine Bible is certainly, it's a tour de force to write that book.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I really want to dig into what it takes to produce something so thorough and thoughtful. But first, could you give us a little bit, just quick, as much as you'd like, on how you got into wine? I really also to hear about your really early working and writing as well. I thought that was really interesting in New York, and then we can dive into Wine Speed and everything you're doing now.
Yeah, I started a number of decades ago in New York trying to be a writer. And of course, at that time, there was no vehicle for just writing as a blog would be today. You really, if you were going to be a writer, you had to try and get published by a major magazine, or for that matter, any magazine. And I collected 324 rejection slips before my first piece was published in the Village Voice. It was on food, on butter. My big idea here was to try starting to write about food, because I was on food stamps at the time. And I thought maybe if you wrote about food, people gave you samples. And it was my strategy for improving my diet. But amazingly enough, I'd always loved food, and I turned out to be a fairly good food writer, because within a few years, my first book was on food. I was writing for the New York Times magazine section on food, as well as lots of other magazines. And then it took a while to attempt to know enough to begin to write about wine.
Wow. And then you parlayed, I think, what was your first article? It was like the best butter. So if you were on food stamps, did you cobble together like all you could just to get good butter and then or were you just guessing and picking?
No, with butter, it was interesting. I went into a store. I was just meandering around on the Upper West Side on one Saturday. And on Saturdays, I did this. I would take these 6 or 7 hour massive walks around various neighborhoods in New York because I was also too poor I didn't have any money to do anything. But walking on the streets of New York is entertainment itself. So I was walking around the Upper West Side and I went into this very small shop and I couldn't imagine exactly what this shop was at first. There were these giant men all in like white doctor's coats with these huge 18-inch knives. But then I realized that it was a store. It was actually a Jewish store for smoked salmon and lox. And these men were cutting these massive, there were salmon all over in the case. So I'm just standing there trying to figure out, wow, how many types of salmon are there? And then I saw behind one of these big white clothed men, this about 2 foot by 2 foot white block in the refrigerated case that had a glass opening, a glass front on it. And I looked, I couldn't even imagine what this block was. And so I said to him, "What is that?" And he said, "Butter." And I said, "Butter?" And at that moment, the lady beside me said, "I'll take 2 pounds." And he took out this machete and just chopped off this giant piece of butter. So I said to him, "Can I taste that?" And so he cut me off a piece and he said, "This is natural butter from farms up in the Hudson Valley, north of New York City." It was the most beautiful tasting butter I ever had. And in fact, so beautiful that you could eat a little piece of it, as I did. So I realized that, wow, all over New York were these small, specialized, expensive Jewish delis that not only had great smoked fish and lox and salmon, but they specialized in butter. So I went around to all of them, got little packets of butter, and did a butter tasting for myself in my 5th floor walk-up apartment and wrote a piece called "The Best Butter in New York." And the Village Voice bought it for $30.
Wow, I know you said you got a lot of rejection letters before, but it's pretty cool to be paid for your first published piece too. I think that's a unique writer's experience.
I suppose one of the bad things about being a writer is I feel like as a writer and a teacher, some days I give myself a talking to, like, how did you choose the 2 lowest paying occupations in the entire universe?
Yeah.
But yes, I was thrilled. I took my $30 and went out to the hip nightclub in New York and sat at the bar and ordered 1 bottle of champagne and drank the whole thing. Because amazingly enough, you cannot buy champagne with food stamps. It's federal law. It's a misplaced federal law, in my opinion, but it is a federal law.
I think it's fascinating that your first article was on something, maybe mundane's not the word, but it's a food staple, right? Bread, milk, butter. But the range, it's actually a pretty good analogy, I think, for the wine world. The range in quality between whatever mass-produced butter that most of us buy at the grocery store and obviously the experience that you can have when you have, someone sourcing locally or an artisanal product in these staples, butter, milk, bread, also applies to the wine world too. Most people never experience maybe what you experience in something so simple but so high quality. And I think that's a good analogy for some of what we see in the wine world as well.
When you're talking about great anything,
Mhm.
great coffee, great bread, great anything, and certainly great wine. The excellence is in the final few points of nuance and quality, right? But it's that little extra dimension that makes all of us inclined to try and buy that loaf of bread that is just going to be ever so much better, but it is that little bit more that where excellence resides. So it doesn't. It's certainly true of wine, but it's true of coffee, tea, cheese, bread, every basic.
Yeah, and it's that extra little piece that makes what's typically common incredibly uncommon because there's such a narrow margin, right? Yeah, I think that's great. So when you talk about starting your career and thinking about writing about food and then later writing more about wine, did you feel like it was the same exercise as a writer to write about those two topics? Use sort of the same muscles that you developed as a writer writing about those two topics?
No, because first of all, wine is categorically harder to write about than food.
Hmm.
With food, you can describe the what is. And if you describe the what is well enough, people can almost taste it for themselves. And they can think to themselves, ooh, I really want to try that risotto or pork chop or whatever it is. Wine is reliant on metaphor and simile. Wine is not its own inherent language. So you have to say this vernaccia. You can't say this vernaccia. It tastes like really excellent vernaccia. You have to say it's like lemons or seawater or cowboy boots or something. But wine has to be like something else for people to imagine it. So that's hard, number one. And number two, I didn't it took me years to feel years of tasting and study on my own because I'm self-taught to feel qualified enough to have a legitimate opinion. You don't, in fact, even to this day, when someone, who's really young makes a pronouncement about wine, I think, how many baseballs have you hit? You really, in order to have some measure of, I think, of validity of opinion, it takes a while. And I don't mean that to sound onerous because, of course, tasting a lot of wine is the delicious work that you do. Yeah, it took me longer before I felt like I could write about wine.
That makes a lot of sense. It's funny you bring up Vernaccia. I was just looking at our Google Home has a little photos, and I had us in San Gimignano, and I was trying to remember Vernaccia as fast as I could. When things though, let's fast forward a little bit to, obviously, I think a lot of our listeners will know you for the Wine Bible, but in the meantime, you started writing about wine. You actually were in a PBS show, and I think you won an Emmy for that. Can you fast forward us through your whirlwind career there before the Wine Bible and Wine Speed?
Wine, Food, and Friends with Karen McNeil was the PBS show, and it ran from 2006 until 2008 on about 80% of all PBS stations. PBS is a kind of ecosystem of small stations. And I think we would have gotten funding to do a second series, but 2009 was the housing crash. And it turns out to be really hard to raise money for television shows. And there are raising money about a wine show is especially hard because with food, there are a lot of food shows on PBS. And of course, we know after that with the Food TV network, we started seeing things like Top Chef. Food lends itself to television because there's a lot of action, right? There's chopping and blending and pounding and slicing and all of those things that you can watch. And food companies are inclined to advertise. They always have, right? Whether it's breakfast cereals or olive oils or any number of things, foods advertised. Wine companies have been reluctant to advertise. And in some cases, they're under really tough strictures, ethical standards that prevent them from advertising. And wine doesn't have a whole lot of movement. So it's hard to raise money to do a wine show, which is why today there are no wine shows on television. And I continue to think that a global show about wine and culture would be really fascinating to do. Unfortunately, it would also take about $5 or $6 million to do, and that's not easy to raise.
Yeah, I completely understand that. We are friends with a few folks who are trying to do something similar. Our buddy Vince Answer is in Vias for Vino. He's trying to do that, but as he's saying, it's tough. You got to make sure you can get all the funds. So you're doing all of these things. You did your TV show. What led you to want to create kind of not a compendium, but such a complex and thorough version of a book? I'm looking down because I have the latest copy right here of a wine Bible. And what I guess one of my favorite parts is the kind of the context you give. You always bring people into the region, the place, the history, as well as also the food. What made you take that approach rather than maybe something a little more academic?
The Wine Bible is somewhat academic. I think of myself as one of the best wine researchers out there, actually. But I remembered when I started the Wine Bible, I was so aware of how hard wine was for me to learn. I felt I'm a reasonably intelligent person, but learning about wine was almost impossible. When I started out, a lot of the big books on wine were written by British authors, many of whom are my friends now, but historically, and in fact, wine writing began in Britain several hundred years ago. But historically, British books were extremely erudite. They were difficult to read because they would go through laboriously the sort of regulations for every country. And they often had stripped out of them all the things that made wine lively to me. So they had culture, food, art, history maybe was in, but everything else was stripped out. And so these books were very hard to read and very hard to understand. I remember because also British authors assume a certain familiarity, I think, with European geography that as Americans we don't have. I remember thinking when I was maybe 23, Meursault, Macon, Montagny, like what were these? If these were places, were they inside one another? It was the simplest thing, could take a long time to figure out. And when it came time for me to write the Wine Bible, which I didn't call the Wine Bible at all, ever in the beginning, I think I wrote it from the standpoint of being your best friend. And let me help you. Let me explain how this works. I know it doesn't seem like it's logical, but here's why X is true. And if X is true, that leads to Y being true. And the thing that people tell me all the time, I have just file cabinets of letters from people saying, it's so easy to read the Wine Bible. There's so much information in there, but it's really easy to read. And I feel like you're just talking to me. And that was a very different way of writing about wine than had ever occurred at that point.
Yeah, I think that's what I was getting at. Not academic. It just seems like it's easy to consume. It's almost a narrative type story. I was picturing it more referential instead of academic would have been the right words. Put it next to the Oxford Companion, and they're both, you can get a lot of the same information, but it's just delivered in a completely different way. And so I took my interest on my exam after watching the movie Somm. I knew nothing about wine. So your book was my first intro to like all of these grapes and what acid and structure and all that was. And after reading it, I passed that easily and then passed the certified a month and a half later. It obviously works. I guess when it came to your book and how you started explaining great wine, I also think something that's really interesting here is you get your personal personality through a lot of these things, which I also appreciate because a lot of people, if they do leave in stories, they strip out their own opinions or that type of stuff. What led you to want to really include that? And I know you're really pushing forward with that on Wine Speed as well.
Yeah, I read recently that by two PhDs who are brothers. This is a book on what constitutes great moments. And their premise is that we all have great moments in life. And why are some moments great and other moments of your life are just, they come and go. You don't even pay attention to them. And moreover, what causes is it possible to create your own great moments? That's their premise. So the first paragraph of this book says that they conducted a study and they looked at what do people remember in an audience after they've gone to a presentation on anything. And their finding was that about 65% of an audience will remember any story that has been told during the presentation, but only 5% will remember any statistic that was cited during a presentation. And I thought, oh, that's it. That is exactly it. And that is, by the way, the problem with so much about how wine is presented, right? Someone tells you 40% new oak for 18 months, 9 months on the lees, stirred 3 times a week, whatever they tell you, even if you love wine madly, as I do, it's like whew, right through your head and out the other side. Because I don't think we're hardwired mentally to, or let me say it the other way, we are hardwired to remember stories. And a story has to have a teller, someone who is the voice telling you that story. And I felt that it was important to be personal, so that the reader and I formed a kind of bond. You were reading along, and I was telling you or helping you understand how things could be, why they were important, why they were fascinating, why they were funny. I had a good time writing the Wine Bible. I like putting in funny stuff that just keep you reading, so that you want to figure out, why are there more sheep than winemakers in New Zealand? I love stuff like that. I go all around the world just finding those little cultural nuggets that make wine fascinating.
Yeah, I haven't read the book that you referenced, but I would imagine, maybe they mention it or not, but I would imagine one of the other things that audience members take away from a talk is whether or not they like the speaker. I'm sure everyone would be able to answer that after a presentation. I think that applies to wine as well. And so that connection to the author, connection to the speaker, the narrator, like you're saying, is important. Like you said, so much wine writing has in the past been stiff and wooden or statistical. And we're lucky that we have so many people nowadays who care about bringing personality, originality, and thought. And there's such a platform for people to share and debate those things. I think that's awesome. And to that end,
the other thing, if I can interject, is this is a really, it's difficult to strike this exactly right when you write about wine, but people can sense when they're reading something and the author has separated themselves as a class above. I call that sort of, I just had this great experience drinking all this Chateau Yquem. Too bad you weren't there and you never will be there, right? There's a kind of elitism that can get threaded into certain wine writing that you have to be very careful as a writer about. I didn't want to and don't in my writing place myself in a classist position. And it's true, by the way, that a lot of British authors, actually, sorry, I'm coming down on Britain so hard, it seems, but a lot of them went to Oxford or they graduated from Cambridge. They were independently wealthy. They had parents with these fabulous cellars who brought out beautiful Burgundies every Sunday afternoon. that's very unlike most writers in America. Most writers in America do not belong to a so-called upper class and write from that perspective. A lot of British writers don't write from that perspective anymore, but I do think that that's a very off-putting kind of way of writing about wine, and I'm determined to never write about wine that way.
Yeah, I actually, before Brady finishes his other question there, hopped in. I was at a wine tasting recently, and the person leading it was a younger woman, maybe in her late 20s, early 30s. And she was talking about a critic. I won't name who the critic was, but she was like, normally he's condescending, but I started reading one piece and he was like, or maybe watching a video, and he was like, yeah, I just really think people should get back tasting with local farmers or people really working the land closely. And then it went to, and that's why I did this vertical of Sassicaia at Tenuta San Guido. And she was like, oh, great. I can't identify with that. You had me until then. So totally agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to obviously had such success with the wine bottle the wine Bible in its first iteration, but now we've had a volume 2 and 3. Maybe can you just talk about some of the insights that you gained in each of these steps of the way? Just a few sentences, maybe. Not talking about what you added in each volume, but maybe how you're thinking about the project changed over those stages. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, for any writer, the hardest thing to figure out in the beginning is not the content. It's how to organize it all, right? The how and where do you start? It's, the world of wine, it's a giant elephant. Do you start with the feet? Do you start with the trunk? How do you go about it? And one of the things I learned doing let me first say that you also don't have to write a book like the Wine Bible sequentially. You can write, chapter 10 first, and then write chapter 1 and then chapter 29 or whatever. I made the mistake in the first Wine Bible of leaving Italy, Germany, and Portugal to the end. This is like the war. Now it's 10 years. You're on your 10th year of writing, unpaid, by the way, for the first Wine Bible. And you've got the 3 hardest countries to tackle. I could have shot myself. So now that one of my inside secrets to myself is write Italy first. Get the hard stuff really out of the way. And it's not that Italian wine is hard so much as it is. Italy is a thriving. There's wine produced absolutely everywhere. There are no lawns in Italy. There are just vineyards everywhere, and they're very idiosyncratic. They create all these rules, then they don't abide by them. Although some people abide by them, some people. And the hysterical thing for me is, when you go to the source as a researcher, as I do, the source in Italy is a set of government regulations, ironically called the Disciplinare. There is so nothing disciplined about the Disciplinare, but you have to wade through these giant regulations to figure out what is supposed to actually happen in Chianti. And then talk to 1 million people, half of whom say, oh, but we never do that anyway. It's hard to make sense of Italy. So I have learned to do a hard chapter, then an easier chapter, like Oregon. Oregon, you can go up there, you can get your arms around it. Things are as they appear. The wine is fabulous. You can write Oregon fast. So part of what you have to do is, it's like planning a marathon. You have to know what your pace is going to be, where the hills are, how you're going to tackle the hills, and above all, not get attached to the outcome. When the first Wine Bible came out, the publisher said to me that they were going to do a 2,000 copy print run. And I said, don't do it. I only have 25 friends. I've had I had no expectation of sales. I wrote the book because it was the book I wished I had had. But you have to stay really true to your own self in the writing of a book. And yeah, you have to love
Mhm.
the process.
Yeah, one of the things that I guess ties together the first part of our conversation and a sort of reader favorite section of the Wine Bible is the food pairings and the way that you talk about food and wine in congruence with one another. If you had to give advice on maybe 2 or 3 regions that you would recommend someone go to where they could most closely see a great representation of the symbiotic relationship that wine and food can have in a culture together,
Mm.
what maybe 2 or 3 regions would you say? If you go to Spain or you go to wherever it might be, you're going to have an incredible food and wine experience basically anywhere you step into.
Yeah, that is so interesting.
You can give
Um,
you can give one example or 5 examples, whatever you feel.
I think that Europe tends to have many more local food customs. It's harder to find those in California or in Australia. But go to Sicily and all of the food customs are very clear. Even South America has many more food customs that are kind of ancient ways than North America has. I'm not sure why that is. It's not
And
that our go
well,
ahead.
and I guess to add to that, I think there are areas of the U.S. that certainly do have food customs, but they're not attached to wine at all. Whereas when you talk about some of these other places, like wine is on the dad made wine in the backyard and it's on the table, and so that's certainly rare in the in North America, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing that I noticed to your point, Brady, is that in Europe, in a place like Austria or Greece or actually anywhere in Europe, you can say to a chef in a small restaurant, like I'm traveling, what winery should I go to? And they'll say, "Oh, you should go to this winery and my brother-in-law owns this other little winery and you should ask them to drink the whatever." If you ask any American chef what winery to go to, I bet you almost none of them can name a winery in their local area. And that's really sad. And I say that with great empathy for chefs and great respect for what they do. I founded the Culinary Institute of America Professional Wine Studies program out here in Napa. I work with chefs every single day. But I was often stunned by the lack of curiosity that American chefs often have about wine. And it's especially sad because American chefs, they've got trained palates. They would be great at wine if only they would, I don't know, find it interesting, find it as compelling as food. But I think it's a rarity in America, and it's not a rarity in Europe at all.
That kind of makes me think, one, you really touch on a lot of emerging regions, and that is one cool part about getting every wine Bible is what's considered emerging in one book is now it's ensconced in the next one. Now they're more emerging. Do you think as wine is being grown in more states, and I guess in general that will maybe help people get a little bit more in touch with wine culture as things are grown in their backyard? And then after that, I would love to chat more about some of these emerging other countries as well.
Yeah, I think so. There's something, if you're not in the wine business, just through osmosis, when you, let's say, drive by a little vineyard every day on your way to work, there's something that that touches you, that makes you feel connected to the land. And in fact, I read last year, and I put this in Wine Speed, that when you go on Airbnb, they ask you where you're trying to find an Airbnb and what are all the things you want. And there had been, much to their great surprise, something like 1,000 times now higher request in view of a vineyard. And they never thought about that as a category before, like close to schools or whatever, close to good restaurants. These are close to cultural attractions. These were things that you could search for that made sense. But a view of a vineyard, they're like, what's going on here? So I think people do, even if they are not in the wine business, there's something heartwarming and natural and back to nature about being near vineyards.
Speaking of wine speed, I guess actually before we get into some emerging regions, because I think we can talk about that and maybe trends that you're looking at the end. What kind of was the impetus for you to kick off wine speed? And one, I guess, from an outside point of view, was it just so that you could really put the takes that you have that you've wanted to just publish out into the world that other wine magazines really weren't game to just necessarily let you say whatever you thought?
Yes and no. I started Wine Speed, which is a digital newsletter, and it's one word. You can look it up easily on Amazon and subscribe. In fact, I started it in 2016, and the reason I did was I felt that I knew how to write a big book. I do know how to write a big book. If someone says, okay, listen, you have a few years, but you need to write a 5,000-page manuscript, most people would freeze. What? I don't know. I could barely write a term paper in college, right? I love that. I'm like, great, I'll write a 5,000-page manuscript. At that time, in 2016, it was a real energy behind blogs. Lots of people were all of a sudden writing wine blogs. And that was exciting because there were lots of new voices in the wine world. At the same time, when you write a blog, you have no editor. You have no editor and no fact checker. So you have to be that for yourself if you want to be. So I was reading all these blogs and I would be like, but wait, this isn't true. Or no, that isn't how that works. Or this is not scientifically accurate, or any number of things. And I realized that I needed to jump in that pool too. I wanted to write more than a blog. I wanted to write a newsletter that gave you fast information, but had behind it the kind of research that is the research that goes into the Wine Bible. So because I'm used to having really tough fact checkers, I started out, one of my early jobs in New York, I was on like the midnight shift, was being a proofreader. And so I'm intense about those things. It bothers me when people write things that haven't been thoroughly researched and fact checked. So I thought, okay, I'm going to jump in this pool too. And I'm going to write all the little things, the fascinating things, the things you can consume quickly about wine, but that are, in fact, accurate.
So what about, I guess two things. I do love that because you have your section with like facts and you also have numbers, which are great. Like I do really appreciate, number one, they go in depth. They're like very detailed and obviously they're fact checked, which is great because you do see some people put like very vague things like X amount of this is made and that's not true. So I love your facts, but also, and then I do love your opinion pieces too. Let's touch on a couple of the things, like you have things like New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs kind of taste virtually the same. Like, why is that? You got an article about B+ Chardonnays recently. Also, I thought your article on consultants in Napa Valley kind of making wine taste homogenous in some sense was also really interesting. Do you think, or are these just something that you've been thinking about for a long time and then that's been bothering you, or how has Wine Speed become that outlet for you to be able to share these thoughts?
Yeah, I thought a few weeks ago that, man, I've been getting myself in trouble left and right lately because if I write something that is controversial, I get tons of emails and calls and every other thing. I never just I don't know, cavalierly for sensationalism's sake, write something controversial. I don't, and I'm conscious of people's feelings. I don't even consider myself a critic. I consider myself a writer. But I also, when I see something that I think is troublesome, I'm not afraid to write it. And I come from a place of groundedness. I think I have an opinion that is grounded in a lot of experience. And I'm never malicious. But if something is worrisome, for example, with the New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs, it's sad to me that so many of them taste very similar. And it's actually something that the New Zealand wine industry is worried about, because it becomes then a race to the bottom, right? What you see is Sauvignon Blancs that used to cost, let's say, $23 a bottle. Then the way that they're competitive is now someone's $20 a bottle, and then someone's $18 a bottle. And pretty soon you, the consumer, are thinking, if they all taste pretty similar, why not just buy the $15 a bottle one? And that's hurtful to a whole industry. So it's not being mean, it's being, I'm concerned that, hey, New Zealand, wake up here. This doesn't have a good outcome if people keep just go looking for lesser and lesser expensive wines because they all have a striking similarity.
Yeah, it was quickly as as we were starting to talk about opinions. I remembered I thought you had some content recently, and I just could not find it quick enough here while we're on air, about the movement of sparkling wine in the UK and maybe premature comparisons to champagne, for better for worse. Maybe that's a phantom thought that you had got yourself into some mud over those topics, but I'm just curious in general your opinion as one of the emerging themes that is maybe happening in the wine world right now, and one that people have a lot of thoughts about.
I love English sparkling wine. I did a pretty extensive tour there before COVID and saw the industry in one of its beginning iterations. It certainly began before that, but I think that English sparkling wine is, as a category, fantastic. It shares that big arc of limestone soil, excuse me, with champagne. It's the same. It's the rim of what used to be called the Paris Basin geologically. And yet, unlike champagne, English sparkling wine is coastal. It's quite near the water. And so it has a very unique kind of flavor. It's super high in acid. You have to love what the English themselves call English acidity. But man, these wines are so racy and snappy and fresh. I think Great Britain, much to their own great pleasure and surprise, found themselves to be a wine region of importance. And there's all kind of investment now in those wineries, including by the Champenois themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Tattinger has a new big project there.
Yeah, I'm hoping that the scale and volume of different producers being brought here to the States scale quickly in the next several years, because I'm sure I don't know everyone, but there are only a handful of bottles that you can get readily available. I'm here on the East Coast, right, and it feels like there may be 3 or 4 producers that if you went into the largest wine shop within 50 miles of me, you would still only find maybe 3 or 4 producers, if that. And so I hope that changes for their sake and for our sake, gain to enjoy it.
I think one of the somewhat more controversial things I've done lately is we came out saying that we would no longer write about wine in those giant heavy bottles. 40% of a winery's carbon footprint is in glass. And those, what I call Hummer bottles, right? Those super heavy bottles that weigh almost 5 pounds a piece are terrible for the environment. It's already very sad that wine bottles are not recycled as much as they need to be. But for a winery to believe that we're impressed by these heavy, heavy bottles, I think is starting to, the public opinion is turning on that. And now those heavy bottles, which maybe 10 years ago were seen as a hallmark of prestige, now they're being viewed as the winery being tone deaf to our environmental situation, to climate chaos. And what's especially sad is those very wineries that put wine in those massively heavy bottles want to quickly tell you about how important their terroir is. Really? If you care about your terroir, then hello, don't do something that is so obviously bad for the environment. You can't do those two things. It does not make any sense. I've tasted lately a couple of really wonderful wines from big bottles. Not going to write about them.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the consumer too is also starting. I don't know if it was COVID making everybody aware of supply chains, but it's not just the making and the production of these bottles; it's the transporting them over thousands of miles that really accumulate. So I'm right with you. I'm a big light bottle person. I think our podcasts hopefully are too, because we've talked about it so much. But before we go here, I would love to hear a little bit more about, I do think lighter bottles is a trend. I do see people, like, at least reading the wine business news, I see people highlighting when they are converting. What other trends are you seeing that you would like to, that are positive maybe, and then other wine regions that maybe you're excited about as we wrap up here?
Yeah, the news in the wine world has been for almost a year now sad, demoralizing, depressing, very negative. And it was by reading so much this spring and being saddened by the narrative around wine that caused me to come up with the idea called Come Over October. Come Over October, we are still in the month of October as we record this, but it has, that movement, that campaign has reached 1.7 billion impressions. There are 1,000 stores around the United States doing right now Come Over October promotions. We have more than 100 wineries and trade associations who are amplifying the message, my message, which is that wine is a communal beverage that brings us together. There has been no beverage like this in the history of mankind. Everyone who is a wine drinker has had the experience of sharing wine with someone they didn't know, and after that, they're that person's friend. That is a really interesting phenomenon. Also, when you ask someone, like, what's the most impactful wine you ever had, or the best, or the one that moved you the most, people always remember who they were with when they had that special wine, right? And I find that psychologically so interesting. I think wine causes us to be generous and open-minded and sharing and together, and it brings people together. And in all of the recent bad news, we've lost sight of that essential, critical fact of wine's ability to not be divisive, to bring us together. Come Over October has been my most recent campaign, if you will. And it's been so successful that it will now be an annual event. And our plans, I have 2 business partners in Come Over October. I'm donating all of my time to it, as are Kimberly Charles and Gino Colangelo, my 2 partners. And the 3 of us plan an even huger Come Over October campaign next year.
That's awesome. Yeah. So you're doing so much these days, and obviously you have to prioritize your time, be very diligent about the way that you prioritize your time. Do you have a lot of traveling coming up in the next 6 to 9 months? That is most of that for presenting and speaking? Is most of it research and tasting, or does it all blend together? What are your maybe priorities for the next 6 months
Yeah.
like what you're working on?
Oh my goodness. In the last 6 weeks, I've been in the Mosul, South Africa,
All over.
Houston, New York, Washington, D.C., Taipei, Hong Kong, and Singapore.
Wow.
And some of those were for Come Over October in Washington, D.C. We presented to the National Wine Caucus in the Congressional Wine Caucus, which was a super high of a career highlight for me. In Asia, I was giving master classes on what makes great wine great. In South Africa and the Mosul, I was starting Wine Bible 4, doing research in both of those countries, both of those places, which make fantastic wine. So South Africa will likely be the first chapter I write about for Wine Bible 4. It takes about 5 years to write that book. But it used to take 10, so I'm getting twice that.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to ask, I guess we started wrapping up before I even asked, how many are you, like, how big is the team that helps you create Wine Bible? And are you traveling? Are you the primary author in most of the sections, or is it like the Oxford Companion where they get guests to fill spots?
No, I have my own voice that people associate with the Wine Bible. I write every single word myself. And for Wine Bible 2 and Wine Bible 3, I had a team of researchers who would help find information, always going directly to the source. But I write every single word, which is in part why it takes so long. I would say I still, even though I do have a team of researchers and a photo researcher and someone who is just organizing all of the information in how we do edits, etc., how we do side boxes. But I would say I probably still do 80% of the research too, because I have I'm relentless about. In fact, once a researcher for Wine Bible 3 was having trouble finding a certain fact or certain piece of information. And I said, call the EU. And then I kept going. And I looked at this person who was like 28, and she said to me, call the EU? I'm like, yeah, call the EU. They've got a phone. I would call the EU. I have no problem doing any of that. But I think it's a funny thing to a person who is younger than me, the idea that you could actually, just in pursuit of information, there was no stopping me.
Right to the source.
Right to the source.
Yeah. That's awesome. We're super glad that you've spent so much of your time pouring out your knowledge and with care too, like you said, adding narrative and your own opinion and experience, not just recording facts and information, but recording these volumes for all of us, which will certainly outlast your career and hopefully keep adding to the wine world for a long time. So really appreciate that work. And also glad for the work that you're doing with Come Over October.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
All right, that was our interview with Karen McNeil. I hope everybody enjoyed the long-awaited conversation as much as I did. Definitely go buy a Wine Bible if you don't have one yet. Subscribe to Wine Speed, and then use the knowledge that you gain on both of those platforms to share wine with your Coravin, with your friends and family as they visit over the holidays, like Brady mentioned. We have a lot of great interviews lined up for the rest of the holiday season, so stay tuned for more. And that is our episode for this week, and we'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.